gonna give people a few more minutes. It's right here. Here, you have a comment, question? I can't hear you if you're speaking.
Hey, Rafat, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can now.
All right.
Will you be presenting by yourself, Peter, or somebody else will present too?
I'll be presenting by myself.
Okay. Meanwhile, can we get a volunteer for taking notes? Somebody? Just major important notes, not every word that is being said. Come on, somebody volunteer. No volunteers.
I can take notes.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Aaron.
Wait 1 more minute and then get going. Okay, let's get going. Okay. Welcome, everyone. So this is to start a series of interims for the OAUTH work group. And as a reminder, not well applies here. So this governs everything that we do at IETF. So if you're not familiar with this, make sure to familiarize yourself with the not well. It is important. So we have a series of interims, 4 meetings today. Peter will start with the register on first use and SPIFFE and DCR. And next week we have OAuth client ID prefix with client ID metadata. After that, updating security BCP. We published security BCP recently, but there's already some work in that area, so discuss that. And then Arndt will be talking about SPIFFE client authentication in October. So that's our agenda or our plan for this series. Any questions, any comments? If not, I will hand it to Peter, do you want to share? Should I share? You should be able to share.
Should I share? I uploaded to Data Tracker. Ah, there we go.
There you go. So you can. I think you can move it around, right?
Let's see. Yes, I can.
Perfect.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Rafat, for scheduling this interim. So when I originally proposed this, I was really thinking about the fact that there were several sessions on or several proposals in Madrid that talked about client registration. And so today I'm going to talk about two of those, but I'll also try and give some context for why this is coming up, or at least one of my observations was that there's different drafts are coming at the problem from different approaches, and so talking a little bit about those and really talking about spending time to talk about the two drafts that we introduced in Madrid and what the background and the context are for those as well. So avoiding the dreaded agenda slide, so we'll have OKRs. Thanks, Brian. And so, walking out of this, hopefully there's some sort of clarity around why this work around automated client registration, why that's important, some of the core ideas as we've been approaching this, and then two concrete proposals, and also talk a little bit, there's also now implementations of these. I also want to talk a little bit about other approaches. I think there could be more than one way to solve this. I think one of the questions is whether we need more than one way to solve it, and then sort of some ideas about what to do next and how to progress. So that's kind of in terms of OKRs for today. So first of all, right, so why bother with automated client registration? Why is this sort of coming up? And what's the context, right? And this is sort of the perspective that I have on it, and I'm sure others have sort of seen different things as well. So one of the areas that I've really been focusing on is this whole idea of trying to get rid of client secrets in general, or secrets in general, API keys, etc. And there's another set of standards developed in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, SPIFFE. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but that really sort of makes it very easy to do attestation and assign identifiers and assign credentials to individual workloads. Those workloads could also be OAuth clients. And so when you sort of have this combination of, if a mechanism to easily credential a set of workloads, and I can now authenticate, then you sort of get out of the business of having to do client ID and client secret type registration, especially when we get into scale. SPIFFE is not the only one of these sort of, let's call them platform identity credential type things out there. Kubernetes have projected service account tokens, right? That sort of is another concept where every workload in a Kubernetes cluster have sort of a JWT token provision to it. And then again, right, if you can use that rather than some pre-registered secret, maybe we can at least make the world a little bit more secure and get rid of all these secrets and all the headaches of the lifecycle management around secrets. Because many of these systems, SPIFFE, for example, sort of takes care of the entire lifecycle of the identity and the identifier and the credentials, so that you sort of don't need to worry about that anymore. And so, of course, right, this then raises the question is like, okay, we can get rid of client secrets at scale with these fully automated systems, but then, well, maybe we can also automate client registration. Now, in many cases, if it's, client credential flow or something like that, you don't always need a client ID, but many OAuth flows still, if any sort of redirect flows, etc., you do need that client ID. And so this sort of raises the question around, okay, can we go a little bit further and also automate that aspect of client registration? So really to just add more and more automation to the overall process. And when you look at it, right, so why not just, one approach could be, well, we could just keep doing things the manual way. But one of the challenges with that, of course, is the operational cost. So operational cost of somebody going in and setting up a client ID and a client secret, making errors in the process, and then maintaining that, right? The whole lifecycle management, especially the client ID, client secret combo. You hear horror stories where somebody would say, well, we thought, 2 of our credentials got compromised, so we decided to rotate everything. And then, 2 engineers for a year and multiple outages before we finally got it all resolved, right? And so this is kind of an operational availability challenge. And again, if you can sort of automate credential management, maybe, and you can also then automate client registration, sort of, we get to a better world, a more secure, more robust world. Another sort of challenge with manual client registration is the heterogeneous environments that a lot of organizations operate in. And it's both the organization and the technical complexity of those environments. Organizational wise, if every engineering team has to go through some kind of process to get a client ID created and have secrets provisioned, and then have to take ownership of those secrets, in very large organizations, it's a big overhead for everybody. And then, of course, the other part of it is technical complexity that sits behind that, because these environments tend to be nobody has this sort of homogeneous environment, really, right? It tends to be quite varied. Even if you try merger and acquisitions, things like that, very quickly your environments sort of become very, very complex. Another driver here is around things like market demand and just the velocity of development these days, right? And so for teams to be very responsive, if it takes 2 or 3 days to get something set up and registered, or a week, this becomes kind of really challenging. And then when you start looking at ephemeral workloads, right? So workloads that sort of come and go very dynamically, and scaling up and down, you may want to, we are capable now of uniquely identify each of those individual workloads. And then the question just becomes, okay, well, how do we, can we also sort of do that registration of the client IDs and client secrets? Can we do that automatically as well, so that not only does it get its identity and credentials, but it can also interact with an OAuth server without having to do a ton of sort of manual pre-work. Exponential growth is another thing. So, again, sort of to the scale issues, right? More and more workloads running. AI, of course, is going to make this even worse because, well, AI will make everything better, but of course the problems around access and provisioning credentials and so on will just continue to become more challenging. And then at the bottom of this, right, from a security perspective, one of the advantages of these sort of dynamic client or these dynamic credential provisioning systems is that you really can get out of the business of having secrets sprawling everywhere. And you can have per instance identifiers and credentials, but then back to, okay, so how do we use that with an OAuth server, right? And that's kind of where some of the thinking or some of the use cases come from. Of course, right, these things are not new, and there are options today. So the first one is around manual registration. It's commonly supported, but like see the previous slide, right, all the issues that go with that. And automated registration, of course, is not new either. And so this is where this idea of dynamic client registration, RFC 7591, I believe, it's already been described, but unfortunately not broadly supported, or not yet. Maybe with MCP that will change, but I think even within that environment, I think people are still questioning whether this is really the way to go or not to go. But and one of the proposals here actually sort of builds on the idea of leveraging dynamic client registration a little bit further, but there is sort of this question around adoption as well, right? So it's one thing to have a good idea, but we do want to see it adopted. The other thing that was interesting in Madrid, and I talked about this, we ended up, there was at least sort of 4 related proposals. I think the client ID metadata and client ID prefix that Aaron and Brian, I think, will present next week at the next week's interim. It's very interesting, and it sort of comes to some of the sort of common problems, right? Is how do we make registration a little bit more flexible? And how do we to what extent can some of that be automated, right? So that it's a little bit easier to do. And so that's a very interesting proposal and complementary or maybe even compatible with some of the things that I'll talk about today. There's also the OAuth pushed client registration draft that I think Aaron and Justin proposed. And then there's sort of these 2 other proposals. The first one, register on first use, and the SPIFFE plus DCR drafts. And those are the ones that I'm going to talk about in today's presentation. Oh, interesting. I see the bottom of the slides were getting cut off. I presume that's just a formatting issue. Okay. So let's look at the core idea behind these proposals, right? So at the core of it is really this idea, the shape of the idea is really, we're seeing customer or enterprises issuing these credentials to individual workloads using SPIFFE, projected service account tokens, even proprietary mechanisms, right? These workloads then need to interact with OAuth servers, and so now they have credentials, so no secrets, and they can authenticate, and in many cases, if they don't need a client ID, that's okay, so client credentials flow or the RFC 7523, the JOT authorization grant flow, those work, but in some cases they still need client IDs, right? And so the question is, okay, well, if we need a client ID, what can we do about that, right? So can we do something? What could the authorization server leverage the fact that there is this attested identity and use it not just for authentication, but also leverage it for registration? And so in a certain sense, sort of delegates certain aspects of that client ID, client credential lifecycle management, and focus on the authorization side, but leave that as an aside. Brian, do you want to comment? Sorry, I probably said something wrong. Do you want to say more?
You mentioned, I think, in the beginning and then just there that client credentials and 7523 don't use client ID, which I believe isn't right. I don't think. I think those definitely use client IDs, but not client secrets. Is that where you were going with that, or am I confused?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to say there is maybe one weird subtle caveat to that 7523 using the authorization grant can be used without a client ID at all, but as we're in the context of talking about client authentication, that pretty much everything requires a client ID.
Right. So in the context of 7523, if I misspoke or missaid or miscommunicated that, my understanding is what you just described is that for the authorization grant, you can do that without the client ID.
Yeah.
But for the authentication flow, you still need the client ID, right?
I would concur with that, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing that then sort of goes like, okay, I've got a credential, love to use it, but and I've got a per instance credential, but now question is how do I get a client ID, right? Does that clarify, or are we?
I think maybe we're talking around each other, maybe not necessarily past each other, but around each other. And then I'm sort of similar but different with client credentials. Like that definitely is client ID oriented. So I don't know. Just maybe an observation.
I may have misremembered that. I will defer to you.
Fair. In general, client credentials is a grant type that defers everything to the client authentication, whatever it is that it's doing, and all the client authentication mechanisms, at least that I know of, utilize some manner of conveying the client ID. So,
okay.
Sorry to interrupt or clarify, but I'll let you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so taking this idea, right, of, okay, can we leverage those? No, thanks, Brian. Can we take those credentials and use them with the authorization server? So if we draw a picture of it, it's really this idea of there's this system that is provisioning credentials. There's a trust relationship between that issuer and the authorization server. And then there's these, you can use these attested credentials, right, to potentially establish not just do authentication, but is there then this way to also the fact that these identifiers were issued under a policy by a trusted issuer, could you just end up accepting these potentially, right? So that's kind of the idea behind, or the sketch behind the idea. So this then sort of evolves into some, okay, so let's make this a little bit more concrete. So that picture sort of starts looking like this, right? You've got something like Spiffy potentially issuing to these clients, and then you have your authorization server. And the trust relationship is really trusting that Spiffy issuer. I'll briefly, just for folks who are not familiar with Spiffy, so what does Spiffy do? Spiffy is really this idea of, at its core, it's this idea of solving the bottom turtle problem. And so really finding ways to bootstrap credentials without having long-lived secrets. And so the way that typically gets done is through some form of attestation. So you can do some kind of identity proofing or attestation of the workload, at which point an identifier gets assigned, and this is where Spiffy IDs get used. And it issues and provisions credentials. Two credential flavors today, X509 SVIDs and JOD SVIDs. There's some work in progress to also adopt some of the credential workload identity token work that's being done in Whimsy. And so we expect that'll show up as well sometime soon. And all of these credentials are relatively short-lived. And so you don't really ever deal with having to do revocation of the credential. Credential is good for as short or as long as you want it to be. But really the idea is that you rely on them expiring rather than having to revoke them. It also has built-in continuous lifecycle management. So you've got built-in rotation. There's no accounts going around. And then the good news, right, there's been some really, really large-scale deployments. And you can do that as an open source or through commercial offerings, right? So there's sort of a good number of deployments out there. So basically, the idea is, right, you get authorization servers out of the business of managing these client identities, get rid of this labor-intensive process. You really trust the issuer to make sure that these credentials should be issued, and essentially do this attestation. And then the credentials are managed by the platform, so you no longer have things like having to deal with expiry, etc. So the first sort of concrete proposal for this, there's the QR code for the spec, made it. So really the first proposal is a sort of register on first use type principle, right? So the idea is I have my credential, I start this authorization request, the authorization server, if it can verify the credential and it trusts the issuer, it effectively accepts this identifier as, or the client presenting this as a valid client, based on its trust that it has in the issuer, can then register the client and do the response. And then and essentially at that point, the workload can use its credentials to access the resource server, etc. Works well with client credentials flow. It's efficient, low latency, no additional registration protocol because the registration effectively sort of gets deferred to the issuer. And then, yeah, it works with X509 and JWT authentication, so you can sort of do, any of those. And then I think the other thing, the one thing that is interesting here is when you have to deal with when you need a redirect URL, that bit is sort of there's some you still have to think about how you're going to register the redirect URL, right? And so that's sort of the specification sort of talks about different types of approaches. Maybe include that in the credential, maybe derive that from the identifier somehow, but it's not like super elegant. But there, at least you have sort of this idea of registering on first use. But you still have to think then about some of this metadata management, especially around the redirect URI. Well, so that's kind of the first proposal. There's an implementation of that, and so there's this implementation from Signicat that Dag did a great write-up on a blog post about this, and sort of talks about different aspects of it as well. So kind of some proof that this actually works, it can be done, but so that's kind of one proposal potentially for it. The second proposal, Rafat.
Sorry. Yeah, if you go back, please.
Mm-hmm. More?
One more, please. Yeah, one more. So that step A, I'm assuming it's a one-time thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that done per domain or like you trusting the SPIFFE server to issue multiple domains, or like can you elaborate a little bit on that?
So you would have to register the key pair for a SPIFFE issuer. And within SPIFFE, you have this concept of multiple trust domains. So potentially you would have multiple trust domains that you want to register, that's kind of almost a deployment choice. But you do have to have that initial sort of registration so that the authorization server can retrieve the keys and verify the credentials. And it may be it should be at least for the one trust domain, depending on how you've set up your SPIFFE trust domain infrastructure, that may be multiple trust domains.
Okay. Thank you. So before you go to the other presentation, anybody else has any questions about this topic specifically? Brian?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to be pedantic again, but it's important, I think. In step C here, is that really the authorization request, or is that the token request, or is it meant to be sort of a more general construct that can mean either? The distinction being, you touched on a little bit, the redirect URI piece, the authorization request actually goes through and is intermediated by the user's browser, whereas the token request is a direct I don't know what you want to call it, system to system, server to server, workload to authorization server request.
Okay, yeah, so this would be, there's two flows described in the document. One of and this should, instead of authorization request, right, this should be the direct, the thing that when we drew this picture, we were thinking about really the client credentials flow. And so rather than needing to have a redirect URI in there.
Okay, that makes sense. In that context, then I think it's actually the token request, and the whole authorization request piece isn't even part of the flow.
Taking a note. Thanks, Brian.
but always happy to criticize.
It's how things get better, right? It's how ideas go from, hey, I think this might work, to, oh, right, actually working.
Anybody else wants to criticize? Okay.
Okay.
Let's go to the second.
Let's go to the second proposal. So, the second concrete proposal, which sort of tries to leverage these credentials that's already provisioned, is really to just say, well, what if that credential that is issued by your SPIFFE issuer, or maybe some other issuer, is really just a software statement that you can use with dynamic client registration. Now, in some ways, that's kind of clean, right? Provided that dynamic client registration is supported, and maybe you need to add some additional claims into that JOT SVID as that gets provisioned. But the idea then becomes, right, that essentially this credential that is provisioned can be used both as a software statement, because it's an attested identity. And then once that identity is established, that credential or other credentials, X509 certs, etc., that sort of reflect that identifier can be used for any subsequent flows, because this client ID is now established, right? So in some ways, it's sort of nice and clean, but it does require dynamic client registration. It is, who knows, right? I think within MCP, there's some, yes, it's in the specification, but there's some discussion about whether, that is in fact the way to really go. Of course, you need a JOT for this, because, I think if I recall correctly, when you do dynamic client registration, that software statement has to be a JOT. And then the other thing that we try to do in the specification is sort of try and generalize it to, hey, maybe this is not just the SPIFFE ID, but maybe there's some other kind of verifiable credential or something like that that can be used for this as well. Not sure if that is necessarily a helpful generalization, but it was sort of, at the time when we wrote it, an idea that we put in there as well. Interestingly enough, there's some, again, implementation. We wrote the specifications. It got picked up by folks trying to experiment with it. So turns out that, yes, it actually can be done, can work. And there's a nice blog post by Christian Pasta about the work that he did on this. I think he used a combination of Keycloak along with SPIFFE or Spire to do this. And so, clearly, again, a workable example. So those are two concrete proposals. Those were the two things that we've described in the documents. Welcome back, Aaron. So what other options, right? So I think we already talked about RFC 7523. So the authorization grant flow can be used without the client ID, but for authentication, you do need it, right? And so you still need to do the registration that's implied there. And of course, it's JOT only, but that's still a whole lot better than using just good old client secrets. And I think a great step forward anyway. And then I think the other one that is really interesting in this space is the client ID metadata. So these proposals have sort of are all being sort of developed at the same time, I guess. And the client ID metadata is great because it solves this metadata discovery, it simplifies registration, but it sort of has this question that we're trying to still figure out is, how do you handle these per instance client IDs, which is kind of one part of it. And then the other part of it is, okay, so there are these existing credentials, they have different identifier types, right? It's not a URL. And so the other question is, okay, can we sort of, is there a way there, right, to get that to be compatible? And many thanks to both Aaron and Brian for sort of several discussions over the last couple of weeks, trying to understand more about what could be done there. And then, okay, the other question is, will this also be JWT only, or could this be used with other kinds of credentials like X509, etc., and all sort of TBD discussions. But there are, like, the really interesting thing here is that there are multiple ways to potentially solve this as well. Christian, you have a question. You say, are these credentials attestations usually key-bound? Can you be specific about what you mean by key-bound?
So is it only a verifiable statement about the client, or is it also bound to the client, to some public key of the client?
To some key. Today, what we mostly see deployed is either an X509 cert, which has a key binding, right? But that's not a JWT, of course. It's an X509 cert. The other version of it is a JWT, traditional JWT, but there's no key binding. Right now, there is work going on within WMSI. The service, is it workload-to-workload authentication, I think. We've renamed it. And that workload-to-workload, thanks. Thanks, Brian. And so the workload-to-workload spec introduces this concept of a workload identity token, and that has a key bound to the token or in the credential, right? And so the SPIFFE community has already picked that up. And so that'll be incorporated into the SPIFFE specifications, and from SPIFFE it'll sort of make its way into Spire, etc. And at that point, there will be this third credential type that can be provisioned that will be key bound, and so that also starts rhyming a little bit with the attestation-based client authentication, I think, which is maybe something that you're thinking of as well.
Yeah, we had similar discussions, and that's why I was asking, because once you have something that is key bound, the key kind of becomes your implicit client ID. It's not really client ID, but it's very, very similar. You can actually bind stuff to it.
Yep. That's an interesting idea, right? And I'm curious, in your use cases, Christian, the key would the key be, is that a long-lived key, or is that a key that is constantly rotating?
It is a long-lived key right now for us, and we are actually using it as sort of a replacement of a client ID, I would say.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. When I think about sort of the way the SPIFFE universe works, right, those workload identity tokens, the keys are even the X509 certs, right, those keys are rotated all the time, right? They're not long-lived. I don't know if I think it may change how you think about registration, right? If you use the key as the identifier rather than the identifier of the credential, right? So in these proposals that we've been thinking about, you would use the subject or the subject alt name, right, depending on which credential type you're using, but you would use the thing that was identified by the issuer, and not necessarily the key or any of the other claims that's in the tokens.
Yes. I think Carl has an interesting question. I think was probably to Christian.
So Carl, do you want to say more about the question?
Yeah, I've just was hearing about the long-lived credential issues and like reusing the key identities for instance slice outcomes. And challenges I've seen is that if you need a stable identifier for the instance that can support key rotations, that is a long-lived stable identifier for auditability or access management outcomes and things like that. How do you address that if you are reusing key identifiers as instance identifiers?
So Christian, is that a question for Christian or for me, Carl?
Christian, I think mentioned something, but I just wasn't sure.
Okay.
It's whoever wants to answer, honestly.
Well, I'll give an answer and then Christian can chime in. So for certainly the types of credentials that things like SPIFFE, maybe Kubernetes, right, these systems issue, certainly in SPIFFE, the instance identity is always the same, right? It's an attestation happens based on the attestation, an identifier is assigned, and the key is really a short-lived key and it's not, the proposal here is not to use that key as the identifier, but to use the SPIFFE identifier, or the whatever's in the subject or subject alt name, rather than the key. I think, Christian, maybe the way I understood what you were suggesting is you have long-lived keys, and therefore that key is going to be relatively stable for a year, 2 years, whatever the life of that thing is. Is that correct?
We have clients that are not that long-lived, and basically the key lives as long as we expect the client to live. Yeah.
And that can be a decade?
No. It's far smaller right now.
Okay. No, just curious about your use case, because I think what Carl is sort of pointing to is if the key changes, or if the key gets rotated, then you don't have this sort of notion of a long-lived identifier, which makes things tricky when you want to do audit and governance type scenarios, right?
So maybe a quick question to Christian, like how long do these clients live? Like when you say short-lived, what do you mean by that?
So for the cases I currently have in mind, we're talking about, let's say, a few months.
So that code is inside.
And we basically have a key that is stable for that time. But I guess that is kind of the question, right? Because if you need a stable client identifier for a longer time, you expect it to live long, then it makes absolute sense to register it and create this like independent client ID. If it's rather short-lived, then it might make sense to just reuse what we have.
Okay. All right. So these are some of the other options that we talked about. It is very interesting how like this rhyming with the client-based or the attestation-based client authentication is very interesting as well. So thanks for bringing that up, Christian. So I think so what next, right? Yep. So Deb, I think your point is maybe there's another way to maintain that mapping, right? So you can roll the keys, but there's some other sort of way to, maybe it's something in the audit logs, right? Just reading the comment. Okay, so what next, right? So I think this is kind of hopefully gives sort of an idea of the problems we're trying to solve and the shapes of the problems. Both proposals, I think it's interesting that there are practical implementations of them, so it's not just a theoretical thing. And there are other implementations certainly that are not public, where similar kinds of approaches are being taken, which is actually one of the reasons for writing down the specifications, so that everybody doesn't do it completely in their own way either. I think as sort of next steps, one of the things that I'm really keen on is to sort of see to what extent we can converge or leverage some of the client ID metadata work. So, is there a way to sort of reconcile the per instance identifiers? Can we use existing credentials? And, is there a way to use a different client identifier from a URL, right? Just because these existing systems already have identifier formats and things defined for them. Often, and those identifiers, they're hard to change, right? Because once it's not just about issuing a new identifier, there's sort of downstream processes or authorization in your authorization loops or in your authorization system that sort of expect certain types of identifiers as well, right? So there's sort of a set of reasons for being able to use different identifier types. So that's kind of, I think, a next thing that I'd love to explore further, to sort of figure out, where to go with these existing drafts, right? Is it something that is worth to continue exploring, or is there actually a way in which these things can converge so that we can have these additional properties as part of client ID metadata, so that potentially we can support these the use of these existing credentials on a per instance identifier with different credential formats or identifier formats. So yeah, I think that was everything that I wanted to share today. Yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions or comments at this point.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. That was really good. So, questions, comments, suggestions. Peter.
Yeah, the big JSON files. So you're aware of that.
Okay.
JSON,
Nothing?
basically.
So,
my convention of this is.
oh, I hear background chatter, but I presume that's coming from your side, Rafat.
Yeah, it's probably from my side. We have I'm losing the neighborhood here.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to next week as well, and maybe, yeah, maybe there will be some good insights next week about how could we merge these things potentially.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks, Peter, and thank you all for joining, and talk to you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Packaging, line up packaging, the first version.